Thank you. Our speaker today is Claudina Scran. This is the 8th time she's spoken at our fellowship, always bringing insight and understanding and compassion to our relationship with the citizens of the world. Claudina teaches at Lawrence University and is the author of Refugee Problems in Interwar Europe, The Emergence of a Regime. Her topic today is the wonderful message of moving societies from war to lasting peace, which is hard to believe, but it's wonderful. She did say that most of her message today up here will be about Ireland, but during talkback, the Middle East can be discussed or may be discussed, especially in light of recent developments. So if we could take a moment of quiet to clear our minds so we can be open to Claudina's message.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jim, for that lovely introduction. I'm so happy to be back at the fellowship today on this beautiful spring day. I also wanted to say a special thank you for the music. I love the song "Let There Be Peace on Earth." It's so lovely to hear it echoing through this room. So I have to admit it, Sarah talked me into this topic. She said the question of war and peace was very much on people's minds. And so when I agreed to it, wanting to be accommodating, but then afterwards I thought, this really is a big topic. And so I just want to clarify at the beginning that we will not solve the problem of war and peace in the next 20 minutes. However, we perhaps can learn something about what a path from war to peace might look like. And that's really my goal. I think it's so important because there are few problems in the world today more pressing and more worrisome than that of war between countries or conflict between nations or peoples within a country. It's impossible to look at the online news, turn on the cable TV, pick up a newspaper, and not see some mention of war. Last night, I was at a dinner in Chicago, and I had my phone, and all through the dinner, I'm getting little text messages about what's happening here and there of different things. In this case, in the Middle East. So it's clearly a very important and pressing issue. But it's also a complex one because the roots of each and every conflict are different, and they're all very deep. Each situation has its own roots, its own political and military logic, its own war leaders, its own victims. And the victims are far too often innocent civilians, helpless children, or fleeing refugees. And I think, as you know, I've spent most of my career studying refugees in different venues in the world, and almost always they're somehow connected to some type of war or internal conflict. And we as an audience are connected to conflict in different ways. Some of us may follow a war or violent dispute closely because we have a political or historical interest. But for others, it's deeper, it's more personal, it's more emotional because we've been touched by that conflict directly in a personal way. Perhaps because you or a friend or a loved one participated in the conflict or is endangered by the conflict. So for many of us, those connections often make it harder rather than easier to understand any particular war or conflict because it raises that sort of emotional uncertainty and pain as we look at the issue. So, with that said, I'm going to try anyway. I'm an optimist by nature. And what I want to do is to leave you with this thought that it is possible to move from war to peace, that people and societies all over the world have actually already done this, despite the violence, the hurt, the tragedy that exists in the world today. The goal of the Sixth Unitarian Universal Principle, a world community of peace, actually is possible. Just recently, I traveled with 16 students from my university, Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin, to Banjul, the Gambia. The purpose of our trip was to volunteer at schools there and then to learn more about developing countries in Africa and what today is called experiential learning. We started in Chicago, we flew overnight to Europe, and then we transited to Africa through the Brussels airport. Now, I'm not sure if any of you have ever made a trip like this, but when you do this, you leave Chicago at night and you arrive in Belgium very early in the morning, about 5 a.m. The students were thrilled to realize that when you stop at an airport eatery in a place like Belgium at 5 or 6 o'clock, they're already serving beer. They weren't in Wisconsin anymore. So we had a snack and then we hopped on our plane to Banjul. And as we were getting ready to board, there are planes leaving for every part of Europe, Germany, France, Sweden, and so on. It was a very ordinary and very predictable airport experience. And there was no sign at all that once Belgium, little country in Europe, had been a bloody battleground, one of the most contested parts of Europe, both in the First World War, World War I, and in World War II. Belgium is also the site of the Battle of the Bulge. From the American perspective, the biggest battle in Europe in the entire war that killed over 200,000 people together on the German and the Allied side. Now, I grew up hearing about the Battle of the Bulge because my great uncle Frank, who was a young man at the time, had been in the Battle of the Bulge. And I remember him as an older man telling how he had survived in the battle, which was fought in December 1944, by wrapping himself in newspapers because it was fought in the freezing cold and snow, if you studied World War II. We left this airport with actually no real awareness that the place we were at had once been this very intense conflict zone. And that's because today Belgium and Germany and France, they're at peace. They're at peace. Now, the reason I give this example is because we often take for granted that the largest conflict of the 20th century, World War II, has, in the formation of the European Union, created a zone of peace that is so strong that it's really difficult to think about war between Germany and France or between Germany and Belgium today. Now, I don't want to trace the entire history of World War II and the formation of the European Union, but I will say a couple of things. World War II obviously ended in a military sense. It was a military conflict, and it ended because the US and its allies defeated Nazi Germany. But that was the beginning of what I would call a military peace or an armed peace. The end of war may be the first step to a lasting peace, but it's not always. The military peace brought an end to the war and created what I call negative peace. What had to happen afterwards is for Germany and its neighbors to build a strong and positive relationship, to move to what is sometimes called positive peace or sometimes sustainable peace. And for that to happen, it's not enough to end the war, to end the conflict. That creates victory. But victory and peace aren't the same thing. Peace requires something more. It requires taking a step beyond that military victory, which is won by one side usually, to move on to a more peaceful relationship between the parties to this conflict. Now, in the case of the European Union, I think it's very clear that there was leadership on both sides that really wanted that. You may have heard of the first Chancellor of Germany, Konrad Adenauer. He was very much a part of bringing Germany at the center of a peaceful European Union. The European Union had supporters from the outside, particularly from the United States, through the Marshall Plan, which, if you think about it, what the Marshall Plan was about, taking the victors, taking money, gathering it together, and investing in the country they just defeated, in the enemy. Do you see how radical an idea that is, and yet how successful it was in rebuilding Europe? And that rebuilding took place along democratic lines, so that you have in Western Europe very stable, prosperous democracies, which is a very part of this. But there's a societal shift as well. And what you'll see in Europe today is a shift from the idea that one can only have one single national identity that is exclusive and perhaps better than other national identities, to an understanding that one can have national feelings, but in the case of the Europeans, they have a European identity as well that represents something bigger than just their one country. So I just kind of glossed over about 40 or 45 years of history very quickly, but you'll see the components of what I see the path to peace. There are internal components, there are external components, there are political ones, but there are also personal ones. And I think that is a winning formula for a path to peace. Now, what I really want to do is to try and illustrate this with a couple of other examples that perhaps aren't as well known. And I'll talk mostly about the experience of all of Ireland, and then a little bit about my experience in West Africa as well. Now, the reason I selected Ireland as a topic, because last year I was on sabbatical and I had the opportunity to visit Ireland. For me, this was really the fulfillment of a long time dream, because of all the places I've been in the world, and having lived in England for many years, I'd never been to Ireland. But my Lawrence colleague, Timothy X. Troy, was there on a Fulbright Fellowship for the year. And so he invited me to come. I started my tour in Dublin, which I hope you've had the pleasure to visit. It's one of Europe's most fascinating and prosperous cities today, with all sorts of pubs, galleries, and sporting events. Many Americans have visited there because there are at least 30 million Americans that have Irish roots, and you may be one of them or a member of your family. I love being in Dublin. I love the environment, but it doesn't take long before you quickly see that there are more than the colorful painted doors, and you'll start to see the kinds of conflict. I picked up this tea towel there, and I will say it's really interesting to see all the way the doors are decorated. But despite all the beauty and excitement, it doesn't take long to see that there's a legacy of conflict there, that what is today Ireland was ruled for many years as a colony by the British, and that when it was in the process of becoming an independent country, the Republic of Ireland, Ireland itself broke into civil war, the Irish Civil War, where different factions within the country split apart over whether they would accept a treaty that divided Ireland. In the end, as you know, the Republic of Ireland was created as a separate country, but it does not include what are called within Ireland the 6 counties, or sometimes called Ulster by the people who live there, legally Northern Ireland by the British. And this division of Ireland has become a reality of the island since the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921. And this underpins the feeling that one gets within Ireland. Now, I traveled from Dublin then throughout the country and decided to go to the north of Ireland, the 6 counties, or Northern Ireland on the British map. And my first stop was to go to the city that's called Derry by Irish nationalists, or Londonderry on the official British maps, which is its legal name. Now, Londonderry is a beautiful, picturesque city with a city wall. It's set up on a hill and it overlooks the Foyle River. Very scenic, picturesque, very touristic. But it also plays a key role within Irish history. It was here that the Troubles, this 30-year period of conflict in Northern Ireland, stretching from 1968 to 1998, really started. And it was here in 1972, January 1972, that Bloody Sunday took place. This is an event where there was a civil rights movement on the part of Catholic protesters, and they were fired on by a group of British soldiers, and 26 people were killed. So it's the site of this very famous and violent massacre. But the conflict in Derry did not start in the 1960s. It stretched back much farther because the area itself was colonized by the British, which created what was called a plantation. And the walls in the city were really set up there to protect it. For many years, Derry had a largely Protestant population whose ancestors had come from what is today England or Scotland. But by the 1960s, it had a majority Catholic population. And that population was often marginalized economically, but also politically. And I think one thing that many people do not understand about British politics in Northern Ireland, where Britain has been a leader in democratic norms in its own country and throughout the world, that Northern Ireland maintained property qualifications for voting through the 1960s. And what this meant effectively is that the Catholic population, which tended to be a lower income population, had much reduced voting strength compared to the Protestant population. This changed during this time. It's no longer the case, but it continued much longer than one might think, given that many of the reforms in voting in Britain took place in the 19th century and the early 20th century. Now, the Troubles started in Derry, but they didn't stop there. They stretched throughout Northern Ireland, and for the next 30 years, there were violent upheavals and conflicts between multiple parties, including paramilitary groups representing the Protestant loyalist side, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, which is essentially the police, but also, of course, involving the Irish Republican Army, which had essentially a political and a terrorist wing, and also involving the British Army, which occupied Northern Ireland beginning in 1972. So you have a conflict with multiple parties to it. The toll of this conflict was deadly. It killed at least 4,000 people and injured at least 90,000. The violence took place both within Northern Ireland itself, but also in other parts of the world, particularly in England and in London. And so, for instance, in December 1983, which was about 2 months after I moved to England for the first time, there was a terror attack at Harrods. And perhaps some of you remember this. There were 90 people injured and there were a number of people killed. And one of my classmates was actually in that terror attack at that time. And I remember when it happened, we were all warned to stay away from the major stores and places within London because the conflict had moved from Northern Ireland into England and into London. Now, there's a lot to this conflict that I cannot possibly go into, and it's experienced differently by different people in different places, even within Northern Ireland itself. But one thing I do want to address is that it's often described as a religious conflict, principally fought between Catholics and Protestants. I think it's much better to think of the Troubles as a communal conflict between different groups that used religion as what we call in political science call a marker of identity. So what I mean by this is people might identify with the Catholic or Protestant religious community and be associated with their institutions. And by institutions, I mean things like churches, Northern Ireland. So the conflict itself was not really about matters of faith. For instance, what does communion mean? That's not what people were fighting about this. It's that the religion was the marker of these communities, and it was sort of a symbol of how they divided themselves. Now, because of that, many people said that this conflict would never end, that because it was tied in with religion, people had such strong feelings about it. There was all the past legacy, the desire for revenge, and then counter revenge. When one person is hurt, then another person is hurt, and then another person is hurt. And this is passed down generationally. And that there was a cycle of violence that stretched back hundreds of years. So many people said you can never end this conflict. And yet, on April 10th, 1998, the main parties to the conflict publicly signed the Good Friday Agreement, which called a ceasefire to the conflict by the IRA, set up a new political process, and essentially agreed that the fate of Northern Ireland would be decided by the people of Northern Ireland and also by the Republic of Northern Ireland in a public democratic process, probably a referendum that would be held at some date in the future. 1998, April 10th, April 14th, right? That is about 26 years ago. That agreement is still in place in Northern Ireland. It's been tested. There have been blips here and there, but it has not fallen apart. And last February, Michelle O'Neill, the political leader of Sinn Féin, which is the major Irish nationalist party, was elected as the first minister of the Irish Parliament. And this is the first time this has happened, because since 1998 to this year, it's been the unionist parties that have been in charge of the Parliament. So this is a very important change in what has happened and shows to me that this process is working. Now, it will be up to Parliament now to decide what happens next, right? Will they have a referendum for union, or will they decide on something else? But I feel confident whatever they decide, it's going to be done in a peaceful way by the people who live in all of Ireland. Now, how did this conflict move from war to peace? This conflict that people said no one could solve, that's completely intractable, yet people are on a path to peace. Well, it won't surprise you that a lot of academics have written about this topic, and I was thinking maybe in that talk track we'd go over some of this literature. No, we won't do that. I'll summarize, okay? I'll summarize. And I do think you're going to see similarities with what happened with the formation of the European Union. One, the leadership really counted. The leadership really counted in the Good Friday Agreement. Some of that leadership came from friendly outsiders. And you probably know that President Bill Clinton of the US was involved, and he considers this to be one of the greatest accomplishments of his administration. But George Mitchell was the lead negotiator in this for the US. He played a very important role as a neutral broker. But the then Prime Minister of Great Britain, Tony Blair, was also very important in trying to encourage and nurture this peace process that ends up creating a devolved Irish Parliament. But the leaders within the society were also involved. And some of these leaders, not all of them, but some of them had been deeply involved in the violence that had taken place in Northern Ireland. They included Gerry Adams, leader of Sinn Féin, who many people consider to be a terrorist. He joined in this peace process as a partner and was accepted by the other people. That was very controversial. David Trimble, the unionist leader, also joined in this process. So they brought people who were war leaders into a peace process. But I think the most important person in this process is perhaps a man that you've not heard of, and that's John Hume. He's an Irish Catholic nationalist politician who was born and raised in Derry, and he won the Nobel Prize for his role in the conflict. And if you do go to Derry, Londonderry, you will see in the cathedral there, they have a sort of a whole room set up to tell the story of his life and how he moved from being a teacher to someone who advocated for Irish civil rights, who then became a leader of a political party, and then became the key person in this peace process. Now, what makes John Hume different is he's a person who believed in self-determination for the Irish people, but he also opposed violence as a way to get it. So he's a nonviolent activist in this conflict where violence is such a part of the way, the language that people deal and discuss with each other. Now, after he won the Nobel Peace Prize, John Hume adamantly stated that he believed the conflict in Northern Ireland could be of value to people in other places. And this is his reason why. He says it's people that are divided, not territory. Without people, any territory is just a jungle. When people are divided, violence not only has no role to play in solving the problem, it makes the problem far more difficult to solve. Now, if you just think for a minute, any number of the so-called insolvable problems in the world, how many of them have been made worse by the cycle of violence and counter-violence? He says instead the solution has to be dialogue, and he's won the Nobel Prize. Now, the Good Friday Agreement called for the ceasefire, the acceptance that Northern Ireland was a part of the United Kingdom until the people of Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland decided differently. Which means that any solution had to be based on the consent principle of the people. And this is John Hume's idea that in the end, it's the people of a region that have to decide what's happened. And I would argue that it's this really respect for the people who live in a particular place that makes for a lasting peace, that you need to have this democratic element of consent to bring a path to peace. It's not something that can just be done from the outside, say through the division of territory or some other means. Today, Northern Ireland is closer to that referendum. People aren't really sure what's going to happen. Some people would like to stay with the UK. It has better medical benefits. If they were to join Ireland, they would be into the EU. They're different cases. My feeling, though, is whatever happens, I see this as being a peaceful process. Now, I could stop my story here, but I want to make one more important point. I've stressed that leadership is key to taking that path to peace. I've also stressed that having concerned outsiders that want you to take that path is very important. And if you cast that in the negative, if the powers around you are what we call spoilers, want the conflict to continue for reasons of their own, it's very difficult to get on that path to peace. Okay, so you need the leadership inside and outside. You need the neighbors to support you. But the idea of changing peace is more than that. You also need people to change. and to move from the ways of war into the ways of peace. Now, this is not a new idea. In fact, it's an old idea. You may be familiar with a famous verse that comes from both the Hebrew and Christian Bibles. It's in Isaiah 2. And it says, "They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war no more." Now, to me, this quotation represents the recognition that peace takes work on the part of ordinary people, as they have to change their lives and their culture to one based on the sword, that is, to one based on violence and fighting, to a culture that centers on the way of peace, on production, on everyday life. And I would also add to this that this transformation is particularly important for young people in society, because it's young people that will bring a new generation, a new way of feeling about things. And it's through their education that then they can lay the foundation for a more peaceful society in the future. Now, there are a number of people that have worked on this very hard in Northern Ireland through the educational system, but also through the arts. And I just want to highlight an artist named Bernard Colin, who has worked with others to create extra large size murals that emphasize peace. And they can be found throughout Ireland and throughout the world as well, including the United States, including other conflict zones. The idea is very simple. If children have the opportunity to work together, it gives them the opportunity to see each other not as the other, but as friends. His model of bringing children together from opposing communities to do productive, creative things has been applied in other places as well. And I think it is an example of when I'm talking about what it means to learn war no more and to instead learn the ways of peace. What is the path from war to peace? Well, it's never an easy one, and it's usually a pretty narrow one. But the examples I've shared today show that political leadership from inside a conflict zone, support from concerned outsiders, the existence of democratic institutions can really make the path less narrow and rocky. But in the end, it's people that need to learn to build the ways of peace. The path from war to peace is never an easy one, but I want to leave you with just one thought. It is possible. Thank you.
Oops. Thank you, Claudina. That was wonderful. It's optimistic, and it's possible, isn't it? Yeah. But it takes courage to let go of the power. And so we will have a talk back. We're being pretty efficient. So about 15 minutes after we end, I'll ring the chimes and we'll have a talk back here, and then we can go out and enjoy the day. So please stand for hymn 159. This is my song. This is my home, the country where my heart is. Here are my hopes, my dreams, my only child. But other hearts in other lands are beating with hopes and dreams as true and high as mine. My country skies are bluer than ocean, and sunlight beams on clover leaf and pine. But other lands have sunlight too, and clover, and skies are everywhere as blue as mine. Oh, my home, and we have all the nations, a song of peace for Closing words. As we go forward into this frightening, exhilarating, confusing, miraculous world, may we offer comfort to the afflicted, our love to those who are lonely, and our wish for all to be safe. And as we extinguish this flame on our chalice, we ignite it inside ourselves. Our commitment to our mission and to one another is an unquenchable flame. Let us remember that we are not alone until we light this flame again.